Welcome to Experience Talks, a radio magazine for the experienced listener. I'm Cynthia Friedlob. Today's show with guest author Beth Baker was recorded live at the North Hollywood Senior Arts Colony. Beth Baker is a longtime freelance writer and editor whose work has appeared in dozens of magazines and newspapers, including The Washington Post, Ms., Preservation, Kaiser Health News, and Nature Conservancy. She's written extensively on medical research and aging issues for the AARP Bulletin, and has been a frequent contributor to the Washington Post Health section. She's the features editor of Bioscience, the journal of the American Institute of Biological Sciences, where she's also a frequent contributor. Her nonfiction book on alternative nursing homes, called Old Age in a New Age, was published in May of 2007 by Vanderbilt University Press. Among the honors Beth has received for feature writing are a 2004 Media Fellowship presented by Case Western Reserve University for a program on the golden years, how will we care for our elderly. She's here with us today for a special event at the North Hollywood Senior Arts Colony to discuss her latest book entitled With a Little Help from Our Friends, Creating Community as We Grow Older. It's a well-researched and well-written book about how and where we might choose to age, and it turns out that there's quite a variety of living arrangements that we can consider. Welcome to the show, Beth.
Thanks so much for having me here.
A couple of statistics in your book that stood out to me were that 13% of our population is over the age of 65 right now, and there are 72 million baby boomers aging as we speak. So how and where we're going to live is clearly an issue that we need to address, but you opened your book with a personal story about how you got interested in this topic. Do you want to share that with us?
Yes, my great-grandfather and great-aunt were killed in a train wreck in the early 1900s. Their car stalled on the train tracks. And when that happened, my grandparents, overnight, had their lives changed because they were expected to move in with my great-grandmother and take care of her, which, when we think about it, well, those were the good old days. Everybody looked out for one another. But the truth of the matter was, my grandmother didn't really like her mother-in-law, and moving in with her was not what she would have chosen. And it always made me a bit skeptical about the way we view the past, the nostalgia that we sometimes feel. And while we think that the way it used to be, which is families looking out for their own, is always the best way, I've learned that it's very specific if that's the best way. And until recently, the only options we had were move in with your family, live alone, or move to what we think of as a traditional retirement community. And I would not include this one as in that category.
This is not traditional at all. Another thing that you mentioned that I thought was interesting is that sometimes people in their 60s are sort of lumped in with people in their 80s as if everyone who is older than 55 is, I guess, the age that we're all supposed to be officially considered seniors, as if we're all the same and we have the same needs and we have the same wants for our living situation. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
It really hit me probably hit me personally when I took my mother-in-law, who's just turned 96, to a tasty diner near our home, and I realized I was eligible for the whatever they called it, the old folks
senior
special, and which they served at 55, and which actually didn't look all that terribly appealing, although it was affordable. And I thought, since then, as I got into this topic, that our society does lump everybody over 55, 60 into this senior category, which really encompasses at least two generations of people, which can be fine. It can also be challenging for communities that are age restricted. If the community gets older and older, it can be harder to attract the younger segment of elders in their 50s and 60s.
Those spry 55-year-olds.
Yep.
Well, in your book, you go through, it's a very exhaustive list of alternatives, of different types of living arrangements that older people can come up with, and a few of them are relatively familiar. You know, aging alone in your own home is usually a popular choice if you can carry it off. Maybe moving in with family members or having family members move in with you is another possibility. Sharing a house, which we call the Golden Girls model, since everybody's familiar with Golden Girls. But there are other types of options that I think maybe people are not familiar with, and some of them I'd like to just go through so you can talk about them a bit. One was the village.
Yes, this is a model that began in the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston, and it's a membership organization that fosters neighbors helping neighbors. And it's really spread across the country. There's about 125 villages and another 100 forming. And the idea is you pay a membership fee, and you can call a central number, and if you need non-medical kinds of assistance, transportation is usually the number one thing that people need, but it could be anything, help with your computer or your new iPhone, which I recently needed help with, walking your dog, temporary meal help, and with that one call, they will find usually volunteers to help you. And it's not just about being a passive recipient of help, I want to point out. Most of the volunteers themselves are members and older people. And the idea is to foster a strong sense of community in all these alternatives. That's my take-home message, that living alone and isolated is really not healthy for us.
Right. In addition to explaining what all of these different living options are, Beth tells some wonderful stories about people who are living there. And one of my favorite stories from the village was that there was a 100-year-old woman who really wanted pizza. But she didn't want to order a whole big pizza because she thought that was wasteful. So she called, and someone ordered the pizza, gave her a few slices, and then shared the rest of it. And I thought that's a great story.
One of my favorites was the lady whose cat needed Metamucil. And she didn't want to buy a whole jar of Metamucil, the lady, I mean, not the cat. And so she called the village and said, can you get me a little bit of Metamucil for my cat? And they did. So there, you can really ask for anything is the point.
Great service. Another option that you talked about is co-housing, which is an intentional community.
Right. Co-housing, people decide they want to create a new kind of community from the bottom up. So unlike the village where you're in your longtime neighborhood, co-housing, you move to a community that's been designed architecturally and organizationally to foster neighborliness and community. So the areas that people have to live in, they're either apartments or townhouses, like we're familiar with, are maybe a little smaller than we're accustomed to. And in exchange for that, there are very generous common rooms. So once a week, everybody who wants to will eat dinner together, and there'll be a commercial kitchen and dining room to accommodate that. Or there might be a den that 20 people can watch the Oscars together instead of just huddled in one living room. And that's also really spreading. And there's both multi-generational co-housing, that's the dominant type. There's also senior co-housing, which is beginning to grow as well.
And that's different from yet another option, which is co-ops.
Right, co-ops, there's two kind of extremes I write about. One was started in New York City in the 40s by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, who was concerned about having better housing for garment workers. And they built this gigantic apartment building that is cooperatively owned. And today it just has an amazing raft of fun things to do, services, I've never, well, maybe this might be comparable, but it's really extraordinary what people have access to. And they've started a whole kind of home health component as well, because they want people to stay there forever. But it's cooperatively owned. The other extreme that I wrote about was in Oregon, although they're all over the country. And this was a what we might have called trailer park, but now the preferred term is manufactured housing park. The land was going to be sold out from under the people who lived there, which was a disaster. So a nonprofit stepped in and helped them form a cooperative. They bought the land themselves, and in that process, they gained not only security, but it really fostered friendship. Forming the cooperative, they feel much closer than they did in the past.
One of the things that someone that you interviewed said that I thought was interesting was that the difference between a condominium association, which you might think could be sort of like a cooperative, is that condos are like tying individual boats together and setting sail, but with co-ops, everyone is in the same boat. It's a nice distinction there.
And a stronger sense of ownership, I think, of the organization in a cooperative, ideally.
You also had something that's unusual, which is the community without walls.
Yes, and there's only one in the United States. It's in Princeton, and it was started by a couple when they were in their late 40s who saw what happened to their parents towards the end of their lives. They were very lonely, they were very depressed, and they didn't like that image for themselves. So they sent out a letter to some friends and said, would you like to get together and talk about how you picture your old age and how we could make it more connected to each other? And they got a huge response. This was 20-some years ago. Now they have 400-some members, and it's basically an organized friendship network. They have chapters now. This is all in Princeton. They have 4 chapters, but people do things like walking clubs, book clubs, monthly meetings, restaurant clubs, whatever they want. The idea is to make sure none of their members grow old feeling lonely and isolated. And of course what happened is, as a lot of these people did get quite elderly, they needed more home health type assistance. And the Community Without Walls founders were determined that it not be seen as a kind of client relationship with each other. They wanted to preserve that friendship. So they started a nonprofit that offers these home health services, a separate organization, which I think was a good solution for them.
You also talked about a unique community called Hope Meadows.
Yes, there's 3 of these so far. These were started by a nonprofit called Generations of Hope. It's what I call the most inspiring of the models in this book. The woman who started it, Brenda E. Hart, had grown very discouraged. Her expertise was foster children, at how, despite everybody's best efforts, foster kids always seem to be a mess, in trouble, sad. So she thought what they needed was a normal neighborhood, a Mayberry of sorts. So she founded, it's also an intentional community that includes families that want to adopt foster children and their own children, the foster kids, and then a big component of this is older people who choose to live there. They get reduced rent in exchange for being very active volunteers in the community. It's been really incredibly inspiring to see how these kids blossom in just a normal community. These bonds form, so the older people become like bonus grandparents to the children. And one piece of evidence that I like to point out of why this model is so successful is nationally, 30% of foster kids graduate from high school. And in these communities, 100% are graduating from high school.
That's impressive.
It's very impressive. I'm going to go visit my first one on this book tour up in Portland. They're in Portland, Illinois, and one in Massachusetts. But she hopes to expand the model.
And that's a great way to provide stability for the kids and then give the older people a real sense of purpose.
And as a matter of fact, they never dreamed the older people would really want to stay for the long haul. And in the original one in Illinois, they've just recently built a home for the folks that are so old it's very hard for them to continue to volunteer. But they built it smack in the middle of the community so that the kids can still come visit, they're still part of things, and they're no longer required to do the volunteer component. But they didn't want to leave. This was home.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. The other version of group living that you talked about, which some of us are familiar with, is affinity groups, which is living with your tribe, I believe you described it. And there's a variety of affinity groups, and you covered a bunch of them in the book.
Yes, well, I put the senior artist colonies in that
Absolutely.
chapter because of the draw of the arts to this community. And I visited Burbank Senior Artist Colony and wrote about it in the book. There's also a community in Florida of retired union postal workers. There's communities for gay and lesbian older people, which is actually quite important because historically traditional retirement communities and long-term care have really discriminated against gay people. So this is a chance for people just to grow old and be themselves. And we visited one outside Pecos, New Mexico, that's really beautiful just last week, called Birds of a Feather. There's also another one I visited on this road trip book tour, was in Livingston, Texas, for RVers, full-time RVers, who that's their home, and they are getting too old, in this case, to continue to live the life they love. So they formed a little nonprofit. It's the sweetest community. There's 35 sites, and they live there in their own homes, their RVs. And then there's a community center where they can go get meals, three meals a day. They can get other kinds of social services. And the people we talked to, again, it was very moving. They said, one lady said to me, well, you know, your family, they may help you be out of obligation. But she said, here they help you out of love. And it was just palpable, the sense of family and closeness in this community. And again, they were bound, this was their tribe, which was other RVers. It was cool.
The communities, the Burbank Senior Artist Colony is the flagship community for Engage, and then we have NoHo, and we also have a new place in Long Beach. And they all are based on affinity, people who love the arts.
What I love about the senior artist colonies in particular is it really turns on its head our cultural assumption that as we grow old, we're in a decline mode and a shrinking mode. And I love how people use the arts to keep growing. I think it's really also deeply inspiring.
You make just a brief reference in your book about the difference between the way we think about older people now than the way older people used to be perceived.
And it's changed over time in all sorts of ways. I mean, I think it used to be traditionally that older people were viewed as wise elders. And then it kind of changed in the 20th century to older people were these passive recipients of care. And then, you know, in recent times, one of my pet peeves is this whole silver tsunami that everybody talks about, is this horror story that we're going to have a whole lot of old people in our society, and who are just be taking, you know, from the federal treasury. And I think this is going to change once again, and is changing, as people realize that older people are a community resource and treasure. We have, you know, lots of hours we can volunteer. We have a lot to give. And I'm hoping that once again the cultural image is going to shift.
In addition to all of these different places that you talked about that seniors can consider living, you talked about the importance of building homes and neighborhoods that support the way older people live in their design.
That's right. We can't just look at our living situation as in a very individual way, or even a small community way like co-housing. All our homes, including this artist colony, are in a larger environment. And this whole move towards walkability, of realizing that we aren't all going to be able to drive forever. Also seeing commonalities between a busy parent pushing a stroller and somebody who uses a walker as far as what the sidewalks need to look like. I think the move in the past of building retirement communities outside of town where land is cheaper, which again left people car dependent. Mm-hmm. I think that is going to be a thing of the past. I think as my generation and people older than me age, we want to be able to walk to interesting places, mm-hmm. to go to a movie, to go to a play, to go to the drugstore. So there's a whole age-friendly city movement that's really just getting started, really way too late when, as you mentioned early on, how rapidly we're gaining older people. Mm-hmm. Cities need to be on the ball right now, looking at their parks, looking at their programming, and seeing, are we going to serve folks so they really can stay here throughout their lives?
Mm-hmm. And then there's the issue of universal design for individual living units, either apartments or houses, whatever. It's not designed for the disabled. It's design that actually is beneficial for everyone, something like different counter heights in the kitchen and grab bars and other things. Are you seeing movement in that direction
Again,
too?
Very slowly. And I think a lot of people think if it's going to be acceptable for some or work for somebody who has a disability, that it's not going to be aesthetically pleasing, it's not going to be what they want. But in fact, the new universal design folks they build beautiful homes and apartments mm-hmm. that serve us all.
In addition to just figuring out where you would like to live as an older person, assuming that you have the good fortune to have the ability to make that choice, there's the issue of how you're going to pay for it.
It's a big issue, a very big issue. I talk a lot in the book about denial, and that's one of the things we're in denial about. However, one thing that I found very hopeful was how many really affordable options there are in my book, mm-hmm. including the senior artist colony, some of, a blend of affordable housing and house sharing. All these things help with your living expenses. I think we have to get real creative about helping people with the home health piece. I think the old way of doing it is not going to work. However, I think there's new technologies that are rapidly being developed. That's the one maybe fastest piece, is the technology that will allow us to live more independently far longer than was ever possible. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's technologies where you can be monitored, not in a creepy Big Brother kind of way, but monitored in a way to keep you safe and secure, so that, for example, your son who lives 2,000 miles away can be reassured that you took your medications that day. Mm-hmm. Or if you fall, there will be sensors that can let someone know mm-hmm. right away. I think we're just on the very beginning of the kinds of things technologies can help us with.
And one of the more extreme options would be robots.
Yes, I went to Georgia Tech and met my first caregiving robot, which was quite an experience. I don't think caregivers have to worry quite yet, but it was interesting. What surprised me is they had done a lot of surveys and focus groups with older people who were very open to this idea of having a robot, but only for certain things. They still wanted the human person to help them. Nobody was ready to just say, oh yeah, I just want robots. But for things like house cleaning, certain tasks, they said, yeah, it might be fine to have a robot. I think, everybody says about everything, oh, in 10 years from now, this is going to be, 10 years we're going to cure, whatever. And they said, in 10 years, we're going to have robots for folks. But it's a very complex undertaking. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you all saw the movie Robot and Frank, but I highly recommend it. We got a long ways to get to that level of robot.
You mentioned that as you finished writing your book, you discovered that you're in what might be called a naturally occurring retirement community.
Yes, it was sort of really serendipitous, I guess is the word. As I was finishing the book, a neighbor who didn't really know what the subject of my book was sent out an email to our neighborhood, to everybody 60 and over, saying, would you like to get together and talk about what your plans are? Do you want to stay in our neighborhood? Do you plan to move? And 22 people came, and we had a potluck dinner, and everybody but one couple wanted to stay in our community, which is very close-knit. So we formed a little support network there, and then some of the younger families were curious, well, why aren't you including us? So we realized we kind of already naturally help each other across the generational lines. So we're keeping part of our group where we can talk about, as we grow older, issues that concern us, and also we do a lot of things across generations. Mm-hmm. And one of my fantasies that I didn't put in the book is that my husband and I, who's here somewhere taking pictures, we have a basement apartment in our home that right now my mother-in-law is living in. Over time, maybe when we get to our 80s and 90s, we could have someone live there who could be a caregiver, not just for us, but for my neighbors who want to grow old there. It would be a way that it could be affordable. So I think that these kind of ideas are percolating out there.
That's
and
a great
will
idea.
Only grow.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. In the appendix, there are two appendices in Beth's book. One is a series of questions to ask yourself, and based on your answers, you get suggestions for the type of community that might work for you. I think that's very useful. But I mostly wanted to say that I really liked the way you summarized what is the main question when you get to this age, and that is, how do you live with purpose and pleasure?
Yes, and also how do we balance our desire for independence and autonomy with our need and desire for community and relationships. Mm-hmm. And I think when you have community and relationships, you inherently have a sense of purpose and pleasure also.
Excellent. Can't end on anything better than that, can we? Thank you very much, Beth, for joining us. This has been really fascinating. And you have a website, I believe, if you want to give us the address.
BethBaker.net. And there are links on my website to a lot of the communities and the national organizations that are in my book, as well as you could follow my so-called book tour blog from my website. And I would love to hear from anyone through email. Thank you for having me.
And that's our show. To find out more about any of our guests, go to the experiencetalks.org website. Experience Talks was produced by John Semper Jr. and me, Cynthia Friedlob, for the nonprofit Engage. Thanks to Engage founder and executive director Tim Carpenter for making this possible. And thank you for listening.